1926.950, General to Subpart V. 1926.950, Application. 1926.950, 1, Scope. 1926.950, 1, This subpart, except for paragraph A3 of this section, covers the construction of electric power transmission and distribution lines and equipment. As used in this subpart, the term construction includes the erection of new electric transmission and distribution lines and equipment, and the alteration, conversion, and improvement of existing electric transmission and distribution lines and equipment. Note to paragraph A1, an employer that complies with section 1910.269 of this chapter will be considered in compliance with requirements in this subpart that do not reference other subparts of this part. Compliance with section 1910.269 of this chapter will not excuse an employer from compliance obligations under other subparts of this part. 1926.950, A1, 2, Notwithstanding paragraph A1 of this section, this subpart does not apply to electrical safety-related work practices for unqualified employees. 1926.950, A2, Other Part 1926 Standards. This subpart applies in addition to all other applicable standards contained in this Part 1926. Employers covered under this subpart are not exempt from complying with other applicable provisions in Part 1926 by the operation of Section 1910.5c of this chapter. Specific references in this subpart to other sections of Part 1926 are provided for emphasis only. 1926.950, A3, Applicable Part 1910 Requirements. 1926.950, A3, Line clearance tree trimming performed for the purpose of clearing space around electric power generation, transmission, or distribution lines or equipment and on behalf of an organization that operates, or that controls the operating procedures for, those lines or equipment shall comply with Section 1910.269 of this chapter. 1926.950, A3, 2, Work involving electric power generation installations shall comply with Section 1910.269 of this chapter. 1926.950, B, Training. 1926.950, B1, All employees. 1926.950, B1, through 1926.950, B1, 3, each employee shall be trained in, and familiar with, the safety-related work practices, safety procedures, and other safety requirements in this subpart that pertain to his or her job assignments. Each employee shall also be trained in and familiar with any other safety practices, including applicable emergency procedures, such as pull-top and manhole rescue, that are not specifically addressed by this subpart but that are related to his or her work and are necessary for his or her safety. The degree of training shall be determined by the risk to the employee for the hazard involved. 1926.950, B2, Qualified employees. Each qualified employee shall also be trained and competent in 1926.950, B2, through 1926.950, B2, the skills and techniques necessary to distinguish exposed live parts from other parts of electric equipment. The skills and techniques necessary to determine the nominal voltage of exposed live parts. The minimum approach distances specified in this subpart corresponding to the voltages to which the qualified employee will be exposed and the skills and techniques necessary to maintain those distances. The proper use of the special precautionary techniques, personal protective equipment, insulating and shielding materials, and insulated tools for working on or near exposed energized parts of electric equipment, and the recognition of electrical hazards to which the employee may be exposed and the skills and techniques necessary to control or avoid these hazards. Note to paragraph B2 for the purposes of this subpart, a person must have the training required by paragraph B2 of this section to be considered a qualified person. 1926.950, B3, Supervision and Annual Inspection. The employer shall determine, through regular supervision and through inspections conducted on at least an annual basis, that each employee is complying with the safety-related work practices required by this subpart. 1926.950, B4, Additional Training. An employee shall receive additional training or retraining under any of the following conditions. 1926.950, B4, through 1926.950, B4, 3. If the supervision or annual inspections required by paragraph B3 of this section indicate that the employee is not complying with the safety-related work practices required by this subpart, or if new technology, new types of equipment, or changes in procedures necessitate the use of safety-related work practices that are different from those which the employee would normally use, or if he or she must employ safety-related work practices that are not normally used during his or her regular job duties. Note to paragraph B4(3). The Occupational Safety and Health Administration considers tasks that are performed less often than once per year to necessitate retraining before the performance of the work practices involved. 1926.950 B5. Type of training. The training required by paragraph B of this section shall be of the classroom or on the job type. 1926.950 B6. Training goals. The training shall establish employee proficiency in the work practices required by this subpart and shall introduce the procedures necessary for compliance with this subpart. 1926.950 B7. Demonstration of proficiency. The employer shall ensure that each employee has demonstrated proficiency in the work practices involved before that employee is considered as having completed the training required by paragraph B of this section. Note 1 to paragraph B7. Though they are not required by this paragraph, employment records that indicate that an employee has successfully completed the required training are one way of keeping track of when an employee has demonstrated proficiency. Note 2 to paragraph B7. For an employee with previous training, an employer may determine that that employee has demonstrated the proficiency required by this paragraph using the following process. 1. Confirm that the employee has the training required by paragraph B of this section. 2. Use an examination or interview to make an initial determination that the employee understands the relevant safety-related work practices before he or she performs any work covered by this subpart. And 3. Supervise the employee closely until that employee has demonstrated proficiency as required by this paragraph. 1926.950 C. Information transfer. 1926.950 C1. Host employer responsibilities. Before work begins, the host employer shall inform contract employers of 1926.950 C1I through 1926.950 C1-4 the characteristics of the host employer's installation that are related to the safety of the work to be performed and are listed in paragraphs D1 through D5 of this section. Note to paragraph C1I. This paragraph requires the host employer to obtain information listed in paragraphs D1 through D5 of this section if it does not have this information in existing records. Conditions that are related to the safety of the work to be performed, that are listed in paragraphs D6 through D8 of this section, and that are known to the host employer. Note to paragraph C1-2. For the purposes of this paragraph, the host employer need only provide information to contract employers that the host employer can obtain from its existing records through the exercise of reasonable diligence. This paragraph does not require the host employer to make inspections of worksite conditions to obtain this information. Information about the design and operation of the host employer's installation that the contract employer needs to make the assessments required by this subpart. And note to paragraph C1-3. This paragraph requires the host employer to obtain information about the design and operation of its installation that contract employers need to make required assessments if it does not have this information in existing records. Any other information about the design and operation of the host employer's installation that is known by the host employer, that the contract employer requests, and that is related to the protection of the contract employer's employees. Note to paragraph C1-4. For the purposes of this paragraph, the host employer need only provide information to contract employers that the host employer can obtain from its existing records through the exercise of reasonable diligence. This paragraph does not require the host employer to make inspections of worksite conditions to obtain this information. 1926.950 C2. Contract employer responsibilities. 1926.950 C2I through 1926.950 C2-3 The contract employer shall ensure that each of its employees is instructed in the hazardous conditions relevant to the employee's work that the contract employer is aware of as a result of information communicated to the contract employer by the host employer under paragraph C1 of this section. Before work begins, the contract employer shall advise the host employer of any unique hazardous conditions presented by the contract employer's work. The contract employer shall advise the host employer of any unanticipated hazardous conditions found during the contract employer's work that the host employer did not mention under paragraph C1 of this section. The contract employer shall provide this information to the host employer within 2 working days after discovering the hazardous condition. 1926.950 C3 Joint Host and Contract Employer Responsibilities. The contract employer and the host employer shall coordinate their work rules and procedures so that each employee of the contract employer and the host employer is protected as required by this subpart. 1926.950 D. Existing characteristics and conditions. Existing characteristics and conditions of electric lines and equipment that are related to the safety of the work to be performed shall be determined before work on or near the lines or equipment is started. Such characteristics and conditions include, but are not limited to, 1926.950 D1 through 1926.950 D8, the nominal voltages of lines and equipment, the maximum switching transient voltages, the presence of hazardous induced voltages, the presence of protective grounds and equipment grounding conductors, the locations of circuits and equipment, including electric supply lines, communication lines, and fire protective signaling circuits, the condition of protective grounds and equipment grounding conductors, the condition of poles, and environmental conditions relating to safety.